How's it going, everyone? This is International Master Daniel Wrench. This is Chess.com, and today's video is designed to be the finale in the Scheveningen pawn structure of our Pawn Structure 101 video series. We have come a long way discussing all of the critical plans for both white and black, and hopefully giving you all of the critical ideas and patterns not only within the pawn structures themselves and the critical breakthroughs and the potential weaknesses, but also, of course, how the pieces develop accordingly. Our focus was mainly on the classical style Scheveningen structures, not on specific attacking formations that white can take against a Scheveningen structure, like an English attack, for example, which, in my opinion, is a structure in and of itself and will be given its own segment. So today I wanted to discuss some of the tactical patterns that exist within a Scheveningen structure that can potentially be pitfalls for white. We talked about a lot of different aggressive tactical patterns for white, shots in the center with on e6 and on d5 with the knight shots and on f5, and we gave some examples of those things. And so here I wanted to climax with just some examples of a couple games of my own. It's always nice to end a series with a couple example games that belong to me personally and show you a couple games I had against a couple strong players. And hopefully we'll learn a couple things. That's a lot of couple stuff right there. I just used that word couple like 10 times. Well, that was an accident. All right, baby, let's do this. Here we go. We got an open Sicilian. And after d4 takes, we develop immediately into the Sozin variation of the knight over, which we have seen for the last 3 videos, if I'm counting correctly at home. And I chose a Scheveningen structure. And after bishop to b3, this is the standard Sozin, b5 anyway. And in this case, as I've said, we've looked at variations where white's castled and driven the f-pawn down aggressively. We've also looked at cases where white drove the f-pawn and tried to break with e5. We looked at the drawbacks of those, particularly over the last couple of videos, including a couple games from Garry Kasparov. But in this situation, I wanted to show one of the more modern variations that starts out with bishop to e7. Bishop to g5. And here I chose them a bishop e7, which is not necessarily forced here, but I played bishop e7, and after the move queen f3, queen to b6, this is a common way for black to approach this early queen f3 variation that I sort of mentioned was an idea for white in the last video. The idea is that e5 here doesn't exactly work because of the move bishop to b7 with tempo. The knight on d4 is attacked, and so my opponent played the move rook a to d1. The other variation here is castles long, and in these settings you'll see a similar type of idea as you would in other Scheveningen structures, where white's going to try to move this queen and drive the f-pawn, and whether it's e5 or f5, he wants to break open the center or create weaknesses and develop an attack. Usually in this setting, black can develop quickly with the move knight b to d7, knight to c5, trying to eliminate this critical Sozin light-squared bishop. And, of course, and sometimes the queen itself falls back to b7, sometimes the bishop goes to b7, but there's a lot of theory in this line, but we're going to get to variations where you castle long more in other types of structures and how white attacks there. This is not considered a variation that has a ton of bite for white, not necessarily really forcing, or let's say topical theory like white's other attacking formations are when he castles long, again, like an English attack or Yugoslav attack, or even some modern variations of the rouser against the classical Sicilian. But this is definitely an option for white. But my opponent, who was a master level player, played the move rook a to d1. For some reason, the PGN has corrupted here and has castles first. But after bishop b7, rook a to d1, we would have transposed. You see, if white plays this move rook a to d1, bishop b7, castles, we'll have reached the same position that you see here after castles. Bishop b7, rook a to d1. Ignore the fact that my queen could have taken the knight there. I don't know why my PGN corrupted here, but it's irrelevant because this position here is the critical one, and it's a pretty standard one. What I want to note is that white had no option to really take on e6 in the situation where my queen was not on d8, because if he had taken, and I take back, and he takes with the knight, without the tempo on the queen, in order to fork the queen and the pawn on g7, white's not gaining that critical third pawn for the piece and sort of launching his attack with tempi, with the initiative. And that was something that my young opponent didn't do in this setting, not at first, but after I played the move knight b to d7 here, he decided to capture on e6. And after I took back and he took with the knight, this was exactly the type of position that sometimes I think inexperienced players who've seen some really nice attacking games where somebody maybe sacked a piece to take advantage of an uncastled king get a little bit carried away when they see the possibility of this, thinking that they're taking advantage of the king's neglect and that the initiative with 2 pawns for the piece as well as the threat of taking on g7 should be enough. But this game is a quick one before we get to the real critical one of this video, just to show that sacrificing on e6, this tactical pattern against the Scheveningen structure, does not really work that well. After rook to g8 here, without a tempo, I think both king f7, even a move like knight e5, letting him take another pawn with check and then developing here with a tempo on the knight and on the queen is also all good enough for a clear advantage for black. But I played rook g8 because it was the simplest move. And after the move rook e1, basically brought my pieces into the center, pointing out to white that my king is not really in any danger here. It's very difficult for white to open the center completely, and I simply have more pieces achieving things than black does. Than white does. My rook on the c file and my bishop on the diagonal, and so this knight on e6 is certainly a beast and an annoying piece. And yes, that rhymed. But the problem is that he doesn't really have any concrete threats to back it up. So he plays this move queen h3, and I played knight e5, bringing more pieces into the game and being active. He played the move bishop takes f6 with a tactic in mind. After taking back, he wanted the move knight to d5. Forking my queen and bishop and trying to get me to capture here so that my rook on c8 was undefended. What he didn't realize was that after simply capturing knight takes g7, I have this simple move king f7, and the game was over in a matter of seconds. He takes back the bishop. Now I'm up 2 pieces. I hide my king, coordinate my pieces, and climax with the discovery on the queen, hitting the f2 pawn 3 times if you're keeping score at home, which, again, if you keep track, that's 17 coconuts short of a full Christmas tree. And so white is completely busted here. And that game, you're thinking, okay, well, that was really a waste of the first 5 minutes of this video, Danny. What did that teach us? Well, it did teach us that just a really basic example that I mentioned in the last video where I said that I was going to give you some variations that showed that if white gets a little bit overzealous, right, gets a little bit excited, starts jumping out of his chair about the sacrifice possibilities in a Scheveningen structure, especially with the Sozen bishop, then usually he has another thing coming, because without the proper timing, especially the gaining of a tempo on an undeveloped queen on d8 and an undefended pawn on g7, then those types of sacrifices aren't anything to write home about. In a lot of cases, even if you get some material for it, like let's say you're not giving up a piece for pawns, but maybe you're getting, a rook and a couple pawns for a couple pieces, some sort of unbalanced material position, which is sort of foreshadowing about the game that we're going to look at right now. Even in those cases, I think that oftentimes giving up a piece in the middle game, even if you get a rook and a couple pawns for 2 pieces, I'm a big fan of the 2 pieces in a middle game. I've talked about that before, because what the rooks need as the game evolves is something that the middle game doesn't really offer in terms of a lot of open files, lots of access to pawn weaknesses, advancing pawns very quickly, things that rooks, support well. Those sort of things don't really happen in a middle game, and so you really have to be careful how quickly you give up pieces for the rook. And even in some cases, if the computers always evaluate those positions as unclear, computers tend to like a rook and 2 pawns versus 2 pieces because they just like that extra point. But computers can play those positions because they just never blunder from there on out. But in a practical setting, the pieces are much better than the rook. And the game I'm about to show you right now, which is a game I played against the now international master Steven Zerk, who's really improved a lot. He's a really strong young player. At the time I played him here, he was a FIDE master, I think about 2350, so he was about 100 points, maybe 150 points lower than me. He was a FIDE master, but now he's even gotten better and went on to win the World Junior, I believe, since then. But this is a game that we played in the last round of the Western States Open in Reno a few years ago, and I think it's a good example of when these sacrifices simply don't work. So let's go ahead and take a look. Right now what we're seeing is a very quick development into, once again, this is not the move order we played, it transposes, but my young opponent actually played this move bishop to c4 on move 3. And after the move e6, knight c3, a6, I'm sort of gaining a little bit of tension in the position, maybe threatening to play b5 if he plays the wrong move here. But I'm not really committing yet because I don't believe that he's going to play like a bad version of a close Sicilian. I'm pretty sure he's going to try to play for d4 at some point here. And so I'm sort of maintaining some tension. He plays a4 to stop b5, and after knight f6, sure enough, he's a better player than just playing into a bad close Sicilian. And to clarify what I mean by that if you play a move like d3 in a situation where your pawn chain is headed toward one direction of the board, usually you need to attack in that direction, and that's why the Grand Prix consists with the f pawn already being on f4 and this knight developing behind it. I say that a lot, and this is sort of a good example that this is a position where the black is already equal at least, and in a dynamic sense, black has a chance to be better very quickly because white's pieces, though developed in a classical sense the way you would teach a beginner to develop, have no real purpose, and black actually owns more squares in the center. Black actually owns more critical squares than white does. Despite the fact that white's pieces are developed a little bit further, black can catch up quickly, and this is not how you would ever want to play. So there are a lot of players out there who still play structures like this against the Sicilian, and this is not an e5 game, okay? And you should learn that lesson here. So, of course, he's a good enough player to play d4. He was simply trying to confuse me with a move order. He's already a FIDE master. And I took and played the move bishop e7, and quickly we were in a pretty standard Sozin type of structure, or Scheveningen type of structure, where my opponent has sort of taken a slow approach, this a4 move not really being standard. And in hindsight, I would say that this is already a sign that this was not the best variation for white. Partly what happens when you try to swindle somebody with a tricky move order, where there's a reason why the best players in the world play the mainline move orders, because if you try to trick a good player and they understand how to maintain the tension and develop, here you have a position where, okay, this could be a normal Sozin, but a normal Sozin, probably white would already have a move like f4 coming in, right? Or this bishop would be on b3 and he wouldn't have wasted this a4 tempo. And in some of the other lines we saw, maybe the bishop is on e2 and in a Sicilian like this, and you're playing f4 and g4. So there are a lot of other ways we saw that white could play these types of positions, and this is not really an ideal one to say it from the perspective that white doesn't have a lot of bite in the middle game. And so I played b6 here, which is like a Najdorf type of idea, to put the bishop here and the knight here. It's not a Scheveningen Sicilian idea where the knight goes to c6. And in many cases either trades there, or you just play knight c6 and bishop d7, the rooks go here, and we saw some games that go in like that. But as I said, this sort of fianchetto of the bishop and putting the knight here is more of a Najdorf type of development, and it's a good one. In fact, it kind of induces my opponent to play f3, and if you remember the last game where we talked about an example where this structure is effective when white's castling long and launching a pawn storm, because this pawn supports this guy and so forth. But in a situation like this, the pawns are not really that effective because white really wants f4, f5 in a Scheveningen type structure. So in this position, I'm feeling pretty good about it, and the problem was exactly that. I think I was feeling a little bit too good, recognizing that my young opponent really had achieved nothing out of the opening, and I was feeling that black is already completely equal here and ready to start outplaying my opponent and win. And because of that, I gave my opponent the chance for this sacrifice on e6 that was probably unnecessary, though again, the point of this game, and I've already looked at it with engines like Houdini and Ribka to show that even in a situation where I sort of allowed this sacrifice unnecessarily, black is still completely equal and in a practical sense was able to outplay white. The best move here theoretically is the move rook to e8, which does a lot of things. I mean, it just puts the rook on a useful line because at some point I might play for d5. And it also just eliminates the possible tactics here where he could end with a fork on my rook and queen. And now the next few moves might be bishop b7, knight b to d7, and begin to put my knight on a good square, and at some point maybe even shoot for d5. So black is at least equal, and white's pieces, like I said, have very little bite. It's like that game that Kasparov just played, where white played f3 with no real purpose, and we would have been happy to beat black here. But I immediately played the move knight b to d7, and either knight b d7 or bishop e7 would both allow my opponent's next move. And what's funny is that I don't know that I would really be afraid of it happening again. I'm not saying that this game really bothered me. I'm saying that I was careless, just giving some self-evaluations of how I played the game. I think it was unnecessary to allow this, but as Grandmaster Milikachian said in a video lecture I watched recently, he talks about if you have the right understanding of a position strategically and you're calculating things pretty accurately, a small mishap here and there a lot of times can be made up for. And in this case, I did miss bishop takes e6, so I'm kind of lucky it wasn't just winning. But when you have a lot of intuition and understanding of the strategic nature of a position, you don't just miss things that are just winning. You miscalculate things, but you don't just miss things that are totally winning, because by definition, that would probably mean that you don't have that good of an understanding of the position, right? Because if there were things that were happening that were just winning for your opponent, then that would have happened to you before and would have improved your understanding. So you get what I'm saying. The point here is that my opponent took the chance here to sacrifice on e6, but didn't really have anything better. And after takes and winning the 2 pieces for the rook, took back with the knight, which I think is accurate, opening up the chance for the bishop to come this way. I wasn't super thrilled because it kind of surprised me. I didn't think it was very good for white. Then I started realizing that he does have 2 pawns for it, and it's really unclear. But as the game went on, I was pretty happy about the fact that my opponent had given me this dynamic difference, this dynamic imbalance, if you will, the 2 pieces for the rook, and I was going to outplay him. Here he played the move knight to d5, which is a strong move, I believe. If he plays a move like rook f to d1, and I played bishop to e6, he moves the queen, and I bring this other knight back to d7. I think this position is also still unclear. But the more pieces remaining here, I can put my rook on c8, possibly play for b5 and b4. And at some point, you end up in a position where there's only so many open files to go around. And I have 4 minor pieces, and he only has 2. So I'm not claiming an edge for black at all, but the position is certainly just unclear and equal, and possibly could have gone this way. But my opponent did rightly recognize that if he has the opportunity to make a trade and open up the position, sacrificing the e pawn for the b pawn to open up a couple more files was actually not a bad idea. And so I think knight d5 was a good move for my opponent, the right move. And after bishop takes b6, I developed. He played the move b3. I played queen to c6. He played the move bishop to d4, and I played d5, preventing the move c4. Of course, he couldn't play c4 right away because I'm attacking the bishop. And so this position here is kind of a critical one if you want to take a moment to think about what you would play here as white. Because I've developed my pieces, okay, the bishops and the knights, and even though he made the right decision with this knight d5 move to open up some files, if you don't continue to try to advance your pawns and get more space and pressure along open files, it's only a matter of time before the pieces outplay the rook. And my opponent, with this move here, showed a lack of understanding of this concept. He showed a little bit of a lack of understanding of, the fact that he needed to be really aggressive on the open files and make active moves with the rooks and advance the pawns quickly, which is exactly what he has. He has a rook and pawns. I have pieces. I want a maneuvering game where I can improve the positions of my minors. And if he's not careful, like I've said in these unbalanced material video series, you can watch that, is that oftentimes when one side starts to get the initiative, when the pieces are so different, like one side has 2 pieces, the other side has a rook and a couple pawns, that imbalance is so different that if the pieces start to get active, it's a chain reaction. It's sort of a snowball effect. It just keeps rolling, and the problem gets bigger and bigger as it comes towards you, and you can't really stop it. And you have to understand what your pieces need in any type of position you're playing. And so in this situation, my opponent didn't really understand that he needed to be much more aggressive. In fact, you could argue, I have a bunch of analysis, but I didn't want to do it here, that even this move b3 was slightly careless in terms of this, and that he could actually get away with the move b4. I think he quickly calculated I would be attacking this and threatening something, but it's not really a threat. The bishop can even move, because if I go here, this guy hangs. And he might even be able to move the queen, defending everything at once. The point is that I just believe that these pawns, threatening to advance, might already be better than what he did. b3 is okay, but in this situation, after d5, he played a slow move that showed a lack of understanding. He was trying to solidify this, maybe a little bit already worried about the pieces, but not the right approach. So you can pause your videos to think about what you would play here for white if you want. Okay, and assuming you've done that, I'll tell you the move he should have played first, maybe the move you found, which was the move f4, immediately threatening f5 and creating some issues. If I play a move like g6, now queen e5 is devastating because I can't play bishop f6. For the record, those of you who thought of queen e5 first, that doesn't work because of bishop f6. So after he played the move f4, or after he would have, I would have to play rook e8, and if he continues to advance, f5, I retreat, makes threats. I have to play the move bishop f6 in order to stop threats on g7. And my evaluation of this position, trading off one more set of minors and forcing issues along these 2 open files here, is that white is the one pushing here. If he plays a move like rook a to e1, I don't really want to trade because my pieces are passive. And the queen and 1 rook, I think, along with the threats of using these outside passers, would be a problem for black. It's unclear, don't get me wrong. It's not like white is just winning. But I think this rook c8, rook e2, and followed by ideas of advancing the pawns was a better approach for white than what he did. Instead, he played the passive move, and a move that helped me breathe a sigh of relief with the move c3. A slow move that kind of solidifies things and makes you feel warm and cozy inside because the bishop on d4 has been brought some protection. But immediately, I play bishop to d6, and I relocate my queen and bishop for a battery that was very hard to stop. And just like that, I prepare for all of my pieces to start coming toward the king side, which is exactly what happened here. Already after the move knight e6, we start to like black. You could argue that knight g6 was also just as effective, but noted should be that I couldn't do it before that because the bishop on e6 would be hanging. So I coordinated the pieces correctly here, and once I play knight to e6, I think he's in a little bit of trouble. He played the move bishop e5, which I think is a good one, trying to trade off some pieces. Which noted should be that this is the same pair of dark square bishops he probably could have traded off by force if he had done the f4, f5 idea. I played knight f4. He makes the right decision not to trade here because the two bishops typically are much more effective than the knight and bishop. An example would just be that a situation with the two bishops operating on all kinds of diagonals is usually just overwhelming for the rooks. The bishops are very well coordinated together. Two bishops can even outplay a rook and a knight on occasion if the if the feeling's right, if it's lady's knight. But in most cases that's not true. So here he played the move queen e3, but after the move rook e8, bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, queen d2. We see that the knight has established itself on f4 in a very strong way, and the two pieces have improved. If you compare this position to a few moves earlier, black's pieces have improved, and white's pieces are sort of playing passively. Noted that these pawns have really not even created any threats yet, which is a problem. I played rook c8, and after king h1, I played the move queen h6, exclam, immediately preparing to just break down the house. And we see the pieces and their activity really creating enough to show you that these rooks, though powerful, and if you can imagine that if you had just two moves differently, let's say this pawn was advanced a couple moves and this file was open, you'd have a totally different scenario. But the rooks need what they need to be powerful, and if they can't get it in the middle game, or if you don't understand what you're playing for and you don't execute aggressively enough, then the two pieces will always outplay the major piece there. So he played the move rook to e3, and in order to find the critical move I made here to break through and kind of knock my opponent out of the water a little bit, you can pause the clock. Think about black's position here and how you can get all your pieces working together. Okay, a good move here, a really strong move that I didn't play that was almost just as good as the move rook to c6. I was nervous to play a move like this because it just feels wrong, feels like I'm leaving somebody kind of naked. But after rook e1, rook g6, with some computer analysis, I showed that even a sacrifice here to try to open up play toward the king is just too slow. The checks are nothing, and black is coming in too quickly, now up a piece. And without a sacrifice like that, I'm threatening to go on g2 as well as take on h3 here, and black has enough of an attack to pretty much be winning here. Not good for white. So I didn't play the move rook to c6, but instead played the move d4, which is a really strong move and a very strong practical move as well. The major point, if you can see, is that he can't take with the queen. As in that case, bishop takes h3 is resigned times. Takes, queen takes, and check Alina Lashlambo on g2. Game over. If he also opens up the c file in any way, he's creating other tactical possibilities here. So in this situation, the best move here for my opponent was to play the move rook to e4, attacking the knight on f4. But after the move rook to f8, g3, the position is still good for black if I find the right ideas. Queen takes h3, queen h2. I can trade and retreat the knight, take the f3 pawn. And this position is probably more unclear than anything else white could have gotten. He only has one pawn now, the rook and one pawn for the two pieces, and a slightly open king and potential tactics. In a practical setting, I would definitely take black. But with some computer analysis, I showed that a strong move b5, taking advantage of the bishop being a little bit overworked, might be just enough to create some strong counterplay here. This was one line I looked at, and I believe that even though black is doing okay here, Black has also been given the task of dealing with the passed pawns and not been able to focus on the king like he would have wanted to. So that would have been White's best chance. But a move like d4 came as kind of such a shocker and really highlights an overworked piece, an overloaded piece, that being the queen, having to guard g2 for Cecchino Lashlamba, having to guard h2, having to guard everything else here, and so he took with the pawn on d4 instead of the strong move rook e4, which would have been a really hard one to find, and missed the tactic I had of knight takes g2, exclam. Pointing out the clear idea, the key idea of this d4 pawn sacrifice, which is the coordination between the g6 square and the c2 square. Bam, slam, thank you ma'am, and this game is over. Rook to g1, I took on g1 and went to the endgame of a piece, and as they say in old school Mother Russia, the Soviet Union, the rest is a matter of technique, and even if I didn't show the best of technique, an extra piece is an extra piece. And with a few more moves, White was resigning. I forced my way into a winning king and pawn ending because that's the easiest thing to do. So what did we learn from this game here, the two games we looked at quickly? We learned that in many cases, in almost all cases, if you're not capturing this pawn, to fork a queen and the g7 pawn, and this pawn is undefended because I've developed here, then you really shouldn't be sacrificing on e6. Sometimes the rook and the pawns can be better than the minors, but you have to understand the unbalanced material principles I kind of laid out that my younger opponent just didn't quite fully execute, or maybe he understood them but didn't understand that this was the time to be more aggressive. And that is that you have to already have open files and the ability to advance your pawns, or at least be ready to rock and roll with that idea. The rook will not survive to tell another tale against the two pieces. One example, by the way, would be that let's say after a move like bishop e3, Black hadn't played a move like castles and maybe makes a blunder like knight bd7 now. Here's an example where the sacrifice on e6 would work. The queen moves and you take on g7, winning a third pawn for the piece. Now you can retreat this knight to f5, perhaps among other things. And here, despite the fact that you already have that much more material for the piece, the fact that you won that third pawn really completely exposes that king for the rest of the game, means that he will have nowhere to hide. And it's a big difference between just winning two pawns and Black having time to play a move like rook g8, as we saw in that first example of my game against the other master player. So that would be an example of a blunder for Black, neglecting the sacrifice on e6, which happens on a regular basis. And I think the problem is some players win a couple games like that, so they get a little bit overexcited, right? They start kind of doing a little dance in their pants every time they see the opportunity to sacrifice on e6, and this is no bueno, no dancing in the pantsing, okay? I'm telling you that. You heard it here first, okay? After castles, queen c7, though, this situation, Black is already that much more developed, so even circumstances when the circumstances are such where you're winning the couple pawns and the rook for the two minors, I still am kind of against it. Of course, I'm not going to defend the move knight bd7. I believe that after rook e8 and then the same type of development patterns, I love Black even more because I believe this structure is very conducive to passive play for White unless you're castled long and developing the attack. As Kasparov showed in our example game in the previous video, Black is happy. So I'm not defending this move, but the idea was to show you that these tactics don't always work in this structure. And so hopefully you enjoyed this last example, the Scheveningen finale. You got to watch them all to really understand all the positional ideas and, of course, the tactical patterns we talked about with the pieces they're in. We will be talking a little bit more about different ideas in the Scheveningen structure as we get into some of the English attack stuff. We're going to talk about the classical Sicilian rouser variations when we get into the English attack structure, because I personally look at a lot of English attack structures even against the classical, but of course the mainline variations of playing the f4 and e4 pawns against the classical Sicilian, the rouser, are also good. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the Scheveningen structure there against the classical rouser, but we're going to be looking at it from White's perspective and talking a lot about the English attack ideas in that setting as well. So this isn't the last you've seen of this structure, but we're going to call it the finale because personally I'm about to throw up. If I say Scheveningen pawn structure one more time, I might just stop doing this pawn structure 101 series altogether, but then I might have some of you showing up at my house and complaining that I've abandoned you and we have, intimacy issues and all those sort of things, which would obviously creep me out. And so we don't want anybody to be creeped out here on chess.com. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm going to see you around.